The morning sun over Alexandria, Virginia, carried a heavy, unyielding heat, the kind that pressed down on the shoulders of anyone caught walking across the vast, treeless expanse of the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center parking lot. The asphalt shimmered with a mirage of early humidity, distorting the geometric lines of the sprawling concrete complex ahead. It was a facility built with the architectural language of federal permanence, rigid, imposing, and entirely devoid of warmth. To the men and women walking toward its sliding glass doors, it was supposed to be a sanctuary. To the system operating within its walls, they were simply numbers on a digital queue, waiting to be processed, delayed, or denied. Rowena Vance walked through the heat with the measured, rhythmic stride of a ghost who had long ago memorized the terrain of purgatory. She was 54 years old. She wore a faded, olive-drab jacket over a plain gray shirt, dark denim jeans, and scuffed leather boots that had walked across continents most Americans only saw on cable news. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense tie at the nape of her neck. Her face was a map of quiet endurance, sharp cheekbones, a set jaw, and eyes the color of a winter overcast. They were eyes that absorbed everything and surrendered nothing. She did not sweat. She did not hurry. She moved through the oppressive Virginia morning with the absolute stillness of a woman who had spent her youth learning how to breathe between heartbeats. In her right hand, she carried a manila folder. It was thin, too thin to represent the sum total of a man's life, yet that was exactly what it held. Inside that folder were the medical records, the service commendations, and the terminal prognosis of General Thaddeus Hawthorne, 82 years old, a titan of a bygone era, a man who had commanded ghosts in the freezing shadows of Eastern Europe, who had held the line when the world was balancing on the edge of a razor. Thaddeus Hawthorne had not just been a commander, he had been a shield. He had broken his own career, his own body, to ensure that the men and women under his command made it back to American soil. Now his lungs were failing. His heart was surrendering to a slow, methodical decay. He was lying in a sterile hospice wing 3 miles away, gasping for air while a panel of civilian administrators debated whether the cost of an experimental, life-saving cellular therapy was fiscally justified for a man of his advanced age. They had given him 3 weeks to live. They had given his paperwork a 6-month review window. Rowena had not come to Alexandria to wait 6 months. The automatic doors of the medical center parted with a tired, mechanical hiss. Rowena stepped out of the blinding sunlight and into the cavernous, aggressively air-conditioned reception atrium. The air smelled of industrial bleach, floor wax, and the quiet desperation of old men waiting for their names to be called. Rowena paused just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the harsh, fluorescent lighting. The waiting area was a sea of plastic chairs bolted to the linoleum. Scattered across them were the remnants of American history. Old men with oxygen tanks, men in faded baseball caps bearing the names of decommissioned naval vessels, men with canes, men with empty sleeves, men with eyes that stared at the beige walls but saw entirely different landscapes. She felt a familiar, deep-seated ache in her chest. This was the reward. A plastic chair and a numbered ticket, a system designed by accountants to manage the slow fading of warriors. She bypassed the main seating area and walked directly toward the primary administrative counter. A civilian clerk, her eyes glued to a dual-monitor setup, did not look up as Rowena approached. "Take a number from the kiosk," the clerk murmured, her voice stripped of any human inflection. "I am not here for an appointment," Rowena said. Her voice was low, carrying a soft, gravelly resonance that demanded an unusual kind of attention. "I am submitting an emergency override request for experimental therapy. Subject is General Thaddeus Hawthorne. Patient ID ends in 4479er. The clerk sighed, the universal sound of bureaucratic irritation, and finally looked up. Her eyes swept over Rowena's modest attire, categorizing her instantly as a nobody. A concerned daughter, perhaps. A family friend. Someone who didn't understand how the machine worked. Ma'am, all experimental treatment protocols require board approval. The board meets on the second Tuesday of the month. You need to submit Form 8 Bravo and wait for a case manager to contact you. The patient does not have until the second Tuesday of the month, Rowena replied, her tone perfectly level. She slid the manila folder across the counter. The therapy has already been developed. It is sitting in a cold storage facility in Bethesda. I have the medical authorization from his attending physician. I need the VA network to release the administrative hold. The clerk pushed the folder back with the back of her pen, refusing to even open it. I don't care if you have a note from the Surgeon General. Without board approval, the system will not authorize the transfer. The system hard locks any expenditure over Tier 4 for patients over the age of 80. It's an automated algorithm. I couldn't override it even if I wanted to. An algorithm, Rowena repeated softly. Yes, it's out of my hands. Take a number, ma'am, or step aside. You're holding up the line. Rowena looked at the clerk for a long, silent moment. She didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the woman with a gaze so intensely hollow, so utterly devoid of compromise, that the clerk involuntarily shifted her weight backward in her rolling chair. A machine was deciding whether Thaddeus Hawthorne lived or died. An algorithm programmed by someone who had never heard a shot fired in anger, who had never watched a comrade bleed out in the snow, had calculated that an 82-year-old hero was a bad return on investment. Rowena slowly pulled the folder back toward her. She did not argue. Arguments were for people who believed the system could be reasoned with. Understood, Rowena whispered. She turned away from the administrative desk. She did not walk toward the exit. Instead, she turned her gaze across the vast atrium toward the heavily fortified internal security checkpoint. Beyond that checkpoint lay the server arrays, the network uplinks, and the regional command terminals that govern the entire Eastern Seaboard's VA medical infrastructure. It was an access-restricted zone, guarded by reinforced steel turnstiles and manned by armed military police. To pass through those gates, one needed a Tier 3 biometric clearance. Rowena walked toward the checkpoint. Her footfalls were silent against the polished linoleum. Standing behind the elevated, reinforced security desk were two young soldiers, Private Caldwell and Specialist O'Rourke. They were the new breed of military personnel, crisp uniforms that had never been stained by anything worse than spilled coffee, tactical vests sitting perfectly straight on uninjured shoulders, and eyes that spent more time looking at smartphone screens than scanning the horizon. They were 22 years old. They had been born after the Berlin Wall fell. They had been in grade school when the towers came down. They knew the military as a corporate entity, a job with benefits, a stepping stone to a civilian contracting gig. They knew protocols, they knew paperwork, and they knew how to be bored. Caldwell was leaning heavily against the counter, scrolling through a social media feed on his phone, occasionally showing something to O'Rourke, who would let out a sharp, sudden laugh before returning his attention to a half-empty energy drink. They did not notice Rowena until she was standing exactly 2 feet from the scanner pedestal. Caldwell reluctantly slipped his phone into his pocket, his posture remaining slouched, his expression broadcasting profound inconvenience. He looked at Rowena's graying hair, her faded civilian clothes, and the absence of any visible identification badge. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with the rote boredom of someone reciting a script. "Civilian administration is back the way you came. Restrooms are down the hall to the left." Rowena did not look back. She did not look at the restrooms. She kept her eyes fixed on the digital terminal between the two guards. "I require access to the regional command terminal," Rowena said, her voice quiet, cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby like a blade drawn from a velvet sheath. "I have a systemic override to initiate." O'Rourke, who had been taking a sip of his energy drink, lowered the can slowly. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth. He glanced at Caldwell. A systemic override, O'Rourke repeated, as if tasting the words for their comedic value. Is that right? Well, ma'am, unless you're a four-star admiral or the Secretary of Defense, nobody overrides the system. Now step back behind the yellow line. Rowena did not move. The muscles in her jaw tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. She reached her left hand into the deep pocket of her olive jacket. Instinctively, both guards stiffened. O'Rourke's hand drifted slightly toward the heavy black retention holster on his hip. It was a reflex trained into them, though they clearly didn't believe the gray-haired woman standing before them posed a physical threat. Rowena's hand emerged from her pocket. She held no weapon. Between her index and middle finger, she held a piece of metal. She laid it flat on the laminated surface of the security counter. It was an identification card, but it looked like an artifact excavated from a forgotten century. It was not made of the modern, flexible polycarbonate used in standard common access cards. It was forged from a solid, heavy-gauge titanium alloy, oxidized and matte. It bore no colorful holograms, no scannable barcodes, no brightly printed expiration dates. The surface was heavily worn, the edges smoothed by years of friction. In the upper left corner was a faded, monochrome photograph of a very young Rowena. Her face hardened, her eyes staring through the lens with the cold, dead certainty of a loaded weapon. Beneath the photograph, stamped into the metal, was a string of alphanumeric characters that meant nothing to modern military nomenclature. Caldwell looked down at the metal plate. He leaned closer, squinting. Then a slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He let out a sharp breath through his nose. "What in the hell is this?" Caldwell asked, picking up the heavy metal card between his thumb and forefinger. He held it up to the fluorescent light as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. "Is this a prop? Did you get this at a surplus store?" O'Rourke leaned over to look at it, shaking his head. "Look at the photo, man. Looks like it was taken in the Stone Age. Ma'am, are you trying to use a library card from 1990 to breach a federal security checkpoint?" Rowena remained perfectly motionless. She did not defend the card. She did not demand respect. She stood with the infinite patience of a mountain watching the weather change. "Scan it," Rowena said quietly. Caldwell chuckled, dropping the heavy metal card onto the desk. It landed with a dense, authoritative clack that sounded out of place against the cheap laminate. "Ma'am, I'm not going to put this piece of scrap metal into a secure federal terminal. It doesn't even have a magnetic strip. It doesn't have an RFID chip. It's a piece of junk. There is an encrypted micro-lattice embedded within the alloy," Rowena stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "It interfaces via close-range frequency induction. Scan it." Caldwell looked at O'Rourke. O'Rourke rolled his eyes, a broad, mocking grin on his face. "Just do it, Caldwell. Humor her. Let the machine beep red so we can get her out of here and I can finish my drink. I think she's lost her medication schedule." Caldwell sighed heavily, the very picture of a young man forced to humor the delusions of the elderly. "All right, lady, watch the screen. Watch the big red X pop up, and then I'm calling a facility escort to walk you out to the parking lot." Caldwell picked up the heavy titanium card. He gripped it casually, arrogantly. He moved his hand toward the modern, sleek, black surface of the secure biometric scanner mounted on the desk. He swiped the metal plate across the inductive reader. He expected a harsh, immediate electronic buzz. He expected the screen to flash red with an unrecognized format error. He expected the validation of his own arrogance. Instead, there was nothing. Silence. The ambient, rhythmic humming of the scanner terminal ceased instantly. The cooling fan inside the computer tower beneath the desk ground to a sudden, unnatural halt. Caldwell frowned. He tapped the touchscreen monitor. "What the? Did this thing just short out the reader?" O'Rourke leaned forward, the smirk fading slightly from his face. "Did you break it?" "I didn't do anything," Caldwell muttered, jabbing his finger against the black screen. "The whole terminal just died." Rowena did not look at the screen. She looked at Caldwell's eyes. She watched the irritation in them begin to curdle into confusion. Then, from deep within the architecture of the building, a sound began to build. It did not originate from the terminal on the desk. It came from the walls. It came from the ceiling. It was a low, subsonic vibration, a digital pulse that seemed to resonate in the marrow of the bone. On the desk, the black screen of the security terminal suddenly flared to life, but it did not boot into the standard blue and white interface of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It did not display the crest of the Department of Defense. The screen burned a brilliant, blinding, unearthly gold. Caldwell stumbled backward, knocking his knee against the metal desk. O'Rourke dropped his energy drink. The aluminum can clattered to the floor, spilling pale yellow liquid across the linoleum, forgotten. In the center of the golden screen, a massive shape began to render. It was a black, inverted triangle. Within the triangle, etched in lines of impossibly sharp white light, was a symbol resembling a predatory bird clutching a shattered sword. Beneath the emblem, stark black text materialized, flashing with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Vanguard 7 clearance. Omega absolute identity verified. Vance, Rowena. Caldwell stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, his brain failing to process the visual information. Vanguard? What the hell is Vanguard? That's not a military designation. The system is glitching, O'Rourke stammered, his hand hovering uselessly over his radio. Hit the reset, hit the manual reset. But Caldwell couldn't move. He was staring past the terminal now, looking up at the massive wall-mounted monitors that hung high above the atrium lobby. These monitors usually displayed news channels, queue numbers, and facility maps. One by one, in rapid, cascading succession, every single monitor in the cavernous room snapped to black. A fraction of a second later, every screen ignited with the same blinding gold. The black inverted triangle, the shattered sword, Vanguard 7. The ambient lighting in the atrium suddenly cut out. The bright, cheerful fluorescent bulbs died, plunging the vast room into a twilight gloom. A second later, emergency tactical lighting engaged. Blood-red halogen bulbs flared to life along the baseboards and the ceiling tracks, bathing the entire facility in the color of an open wound. Then came the sound. It was not a fire alarm. It was not a standard security breach siren. It was a deep, guttural, oscillating klaxon, a sound designed in the darkest days of the Cold War to signify that the absolute worst-case scenario had arrived. It was the sound of the world ending. Awooga! Awooga! Above the security desk, a heavy steel blast shield, hidden within the ceiling architecture for decades, suddenly disengaged with a deafening metallic clang. It slammed down like a guillotine, sealing the corridor behind the turnstiles. Across the atrium, the main glass sliding doors automatically locked, followed instantly by a secondary layer of reinforced steel grating that unspooled from the doorframes, trapping everyone inside. The facility was sealing itself. A hard lockdown. Not a drill. Panic erupted in the waiting area. Elderly men dropped their canes. Nurses rushed out from the side corridors, their faces pale, shouting over the deafening klaxon. O'Rourke tore his radio from his vest, his hands shaking violently. He pressed the transmit button, screaming over the noise. "Command, this is Checkpoint Alpha. We have a system malfunction. The whole building is locking down. I repeat, the doors are sealing. We have a code." "I don't even know what code this is," static hissed from the radio. Then a synthetic, cold, digitized voice replied over the frequency. It was not the voice of the local security commander. It was a voice generated by an artificial intelligence program operating far above their pay grade. "Negative, Checkpoint Alpha. This is not a malfunction. Local command has been suspended." Caldwell grabbed the desk, his knuckles white. "Suspended? What do you mean, suspended? Who the hell is overriding us?" Rowena Vance stood exactly where she had been. The chaotic flashing of the red tactical lights washed over her face, casting deep, sharp shadows across her features. She looked completely undisturbed. The hurricane was raging around her, and she was the absolute, unmoving eye of the storm. "They are not overriding you," Rowena said quietly. Even over the blaring alarms, her voice carried with terrifying clarity. Both Caldwell and O'Rourke turned their heads slowly to look at her. The condescending grins were gone. The youthful arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the primal, wide-eyed terror of prey, realizing they had wandered into the den of an apex predator. "What did you do?" Caldwell whispered, his voice trembling. "What is that card?" Rowena looked down at the heavy titanium plate resting on the glowing golden monitor. "The system you operate on was built in 2008, Rowena explained, her tone conversational, instructive. "It was designed to protect digital health records from civilian hackers. It is a fence built to keep out vandals." She looked up, pinning Caldwell with a stare that made his blood run cold. "This card," she said, gesturing to the metal plate, "was forged in 1996. It was designed to maintain operational continuity of the United States nuclear command structure in the event that Washington, D.C. was reduced to radioactive ash. It is not trying to hack your system, Private Caldwell. It is consuming it." Twist 1. The alarm blaring through the Alexandria VA was not a call for local police. It was not a request for the local SWAT team. The security protocol embedded in Rowena's titanium card did not recognize the authority of local law enforcement. As Caldwell watched the digital readouts scrolling violently across his locked monitor, he saw the outbound data routing paths. The destination IP addresses were not local. They were not even regional. The signals were bypassing the entire Department of Veterans Affairs network. They were bypassing Homeland Security. The screen flashed. "Routing alert. Oval Office Situational Room. Acknowledged. Routing alert. Pentagon/DTRA Command Desk. Acknowledged. Protocol Last Man Standing initiated." "Oh my God," O'Rourke breathed, staring at the routing text. He backed away from the desk, his hands raised in the air as if the terminal itself was going to detonate. "It's sending distress codes to the Pentagon. It's talking to the White House. Lady, who the hell are you?" Twist 2. Rowena did not answer him immediately. She watched the fear take root in their eyes. She watched the realization dawn on them that the world they thought they understood, the world of forms, approvals, and bureaucratic dismissals, was merely a paper-thin illusion resting on top of a sleeping giant, and they had just kicked the giant in the teeth. The system hadn't crashed because the card was too old. The system had frozen because it was instinctively submitting. The network recognized the encryption signature on the titanium card as a terrifyingly superior authority. The VA network was a private. The card was a 5-star general. The system was locking down the facility not to trap Rowena, but to protect her from the outside world while it awaited her commands. "I told you," Rowena said, her voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut straight through the panic of the room. "I am here to initiate an override." Caldwell swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. The crisp, clean uniform he wore suddenly felt like a costume. He realized with a sinking dread in his stomach that he was playing soldier in front of someone who had actually fought the wars he only read about in history books. "Ma'am," Caldwell stammered, his bravado entirely shattered. The military, they're going to send people. They're going to send a strike team." "Yes," Rowena agreed softly. She reached out and casually picked up her manila folder, holding it gently against her side. "They will send the best they have. And when they get here, I am going to make them authorize General Hawthorne's treatment." "They'll arrest you," O'Rourke shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You just hijacked a federal facility. You can't fight the whole government." Rowena turned her head slowly, looking out over the chaotic, red-lit atrium. She saw the elderly veterans huddling together. She saw the men who had given their youth, their limbs, and their peace of mind to a country that now forced them to take a number and wait for permission to survive. She saw the systemic cruelty of an administration that measured honor in dollars and cents. She thought of Thaddeus Hawthorne. She thought of the cold, damp bunkers. She thought of the blood soaked into the earth, the promises made in the dark, the unyielding loyalty of men who had stood between the world and the abyss. A bureaucratic clerk had told her to wait 6 months. A young, arrogant guard had told her she belonged in the Stone Age. They had forgotten. The nation had grown fat, comfortable, and blind. They had built their glass towers and their digital networks on a foundation of bone and steel, and then they had the audacity to lock the architects out in the cold. Rowena Vance looked back at the two trembling young men. The red tactical lights reflected in her eyes, making them look like two chips of glacial ice catching the fire of a burning city. "I do not intend to fight the government, Specialist O'Rourke," Rowena said quietly, the weight of 30 years of classified history resonating in every syllable. "I am the architect of their walls, and until they save my general—" She reached forward and tapped a single keystroke on the frozen, golden keyboard. The heavy steel blast doors throughout the entire perimeter of the compound engaged their secondary magnetic locks with a concussive thoom that shook the floorboards. "I am taking their building away from them." The klaxons continued to howl. The red lights pulsed like the beating of an angry heart. Outside, beneath the scorching Virginia sun, the air was about to be torn apart by the rotor blades of incoming Blackhawks. Inside, the bureaucracy had ended. The era of forms, waiting rooms, and dismissive clerks was over. The vanguard had returned, and she was holding the keys to the kingdom. Rowena Vance stood at the checkpoint, her hands resting easily at her sides, perfectly calm, waiting for the empire she helped build to come and answer for its sins against its oldest soldiers. The crimson emergency lighting bathed the sprawling atrium in the color of old blood. The rhythmic, guttural howl of the lockdown klaxon vibrated through the reinforced concrete floor, rattling the teeth of every soul trapped within the Alexandria Veterans Affairs Medical Center. The heavy steel blast shields, dropped from their hidden ceiling alcoves, had sealed the exits with the absolute finality of a bank vault. Behind the security desk, Private Caldwell and Specialist O'Rourke stood frozen. Their modern tactical gear, their polished boots, their standard-issue sidearms, all of it suddenly felt like children's toys in the presence of the quiet, gray-haired woman standing before them. Rowena Vance had not raised her voice. She had not drawn a weapon. She had simply laid a piece of oxidized titanium on a scanner, and in doing so, she had brought the entire federal apparatus of the Eastern Seaboard to a violently grinding halt. The digital readout on the biometric terminal continued to pulse with that blinding, unearthly gold. Vanguard 7. Clearance. Omega Absolute. It was a digital ghost story, a myth written in code, asserting its dominance over a system that thought it had evolved past its creators. Down the main corridor, a set of internal administrative doors burst open. The heavy thud of dress shoes against linoleum cut through the ambient panic of the lobby. Silas Whitmore was marching toward the checkpoint. Whitmore was the regional director of the facility. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and tailored wool. 58 years old, with perfectly manicured hands that had never held anything heavier than a Mont Blanc pen or a budget ledger. He was a creature of spreadsheets, a man who had built a lucrative career by treating veteran health care as a corporate liability to be minimized. He received his annual bonuses based on how efficiently he could deny claims, delay treatments, and cut overhead. He was the human embodiment of the algorithm Rowena despised. Flanking Whitmore were 4 internal VA security officers. They were older men, heavy-set, carrying batons and drawn tasers, sweating under the sudden heat of the unventilated, lockdown building. Whitmore's face was a mask of aristocratic rage. The veins in his neck stood out tight against his starched white collar. His kingdom had been plunged into darkness, his authority usurped by a flashing computer screen, and he was hunting for someone to punish. He reached the security desk, his eyes darting from the trembling Caldwell to the golden terminal, and finally resting on Rowena. He took in her faded olive jacket, her unadorned gray hair, the utter lack of any corporate or military insignia. To Silas Whitmore, the world was a hierarchy of wealth and status. Looking at Rowena, he saw a peasant who had somehow stumbled into the control room. "What is the meaning of this?" Whitmore barked, his voice sharp and reedy, trying to compete with the blaring claxons. He pointed a manicured finger at Caldwell. "Private, why is my building in hard lockdown? I was on a conference call with the undersecretary. Disengage the blast doors immediately." Caldwell swallowed, his throat bone dry. He looked at the director, then down at the golden screen, then at Rowena. "Sir, I can't. The system isn't responding to local command. We're locked out, completely locked out." "That is impossible," Whitmore snapped, stepping around the desk. He shoved O'Rourke out of the way and slammed his hands down on the keyboard. He pounded the escape key, the manual override sequence, the hard reset combination. The golden triangle of Vanguard 7 merely pulsed, entirely indifferent to his existence. The heavy titanium card sat perfectly still on the scanner pad. Whitmore stared at the heavy metal plate. He reached out to grab it. "I would advise against removing that from the induction field," Rowena said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made Whitmore's hand freeze an inch from the metal. Whitmore turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing with a venomous mix of confusion and fury. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the person who submitted the emergency override for General Thaddeus Hawthorne," Rowena replied smoothly. She did not shift her stance. She did not blink. "Your desk clerk informed me that an algorithm prevented his treatment. I am simply adjusting the algorithm." Whitmore's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He looked at the metal card, then back to Rowena, his mind frantically trying to assemble the pieces of a puzzle he lacked the education to solve. He didn't know what Vanguard 7 was. He didn't care. All he knew was that this civilian was standing in his lobby, claiming responsibility for a catastrophic cyber attack on a federal installation. "You did this?" Whitmore hissed, his chest heaving. He turned to the 4 heavy-set security officers flanking him. "Restrain her. Put her in cuffs right now. This is cyber terrorism. You have just committed a federal felony under the Patriot Act, you stupid woman. You're going to spend the rest of your miserable life in a black site." The 4 security guards stepped forward, raising their tasers. They were hesitant. The atmosphere in the room was wrong. The red lights, the golden terminal, the terrifying calm radiating from the gray-haired woman. It all screamed of a situation that was radically above their pay grade. But Whitmore was their boss. "I said, restrain her," Whitmore screamed, spit flying from his lips. Rowena did not raise her hands to defend herself. She did not reach into her jacket. She simply rotated her left wrist slightly, pulling back the cuff of her faded jacket to reveal a heavy, mechanical diving watch. The crystal was scratched, the bezel worn from decades of friction. She looked at the sweeping second hand. "Director Whitmore," Rowena said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, taking on a cold, metallic resonance that made the hairs on the back of Caldwell's neck stand at attention. "You are an accountant. You understand ledgers. You understand the cost of a hospital bed, the price of a pharmaceutical patent, and the monetary value of a human life. But you do not understand the architecture of power." She lowered her wrist. "You think you command this facility because your name is on a plaque in the administrative wing. But this building, this network, this entire digital infrastructure, it does not belong to you." Whitmore let out a barking, incredulous laugh. "It doesn't? And I suppose it belongs to you. Grab her." The lead security officer took a step toward Rowena, reaching out to grab her shoulder. He never made contact. A sound began to bleed through the heavy, reinforced concrete walls of the medical center. At first, it was just a low, rhythmic vibration, a thrumming that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Then, the vibration became a sound, a heavy, violently aggressive beating of the air. It was a sound that every combat veteran in the lobby recognized instantly. It was the sound that brought salvation in the jungle, rescue in the desert, and judgment in the dark. The security officer froze, his hands suspended in midair. He looked up at the ceiling. Whitmore frowned, the color draining slightly from his face. "What is that?" Rowena kept her eyes locked on Whitmore. "That is the consequence of denying a dying man the dignity he earned." Outside, the scorching Virginia air was being torn to shreds. Three heavily modified Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, painted in radar-absorbent matte black, descended from the cloudless sky with terrifying speed. They bore no standard military markings, no identifying tail numbers. They were ghost ships, operating under authorities that did not exist on public congressional budgets. The helicopters did not request landing clearance. They did not circle the helipad. With blinding precision, the pilots flared the massive aircraft directly over the manicured front lawn of the VA Medical Center. The downwash from the rotors hit the ground like a physical blow, flattening the decorative hedges, sending clouds of dust, mulch, and loose asphalt violently into the air. The noise was deafening, a mechanical roar that shook the heavy blast shields sealing the atrium doors. Inside the lobby, the elderly veterans who had been huddling in fear suddenly stopped murmuring. A few of the men, those who had served in places where the sky rained fire, straightened their postures. They recognized the aggressive, unhesitating maneuver of the pilots. That wasn't a medical evacuation flight. That was a Tier 1 tactical insertion. Caldwell stepped back from the desk, his hands hovering over his ears. They're landing right on the front steps." "Director," O'Rourke shouted over the noise, "who did you call?" "I didn't call anyone," Whitmore screamed, pure panic finally breaking through his arrogant veneer. He stumbled backward, putting the security guards between himself and the sealed front entrance. Rowena Vance remained entirely still. She did not look toward the doors. She watched Silas Whitmore unravel. Outside, before the Black Hawks had even touched their landing gear to the grass, thick, braided fast ropes dropped from the side doors. Dark, heavily armored figures slid down the ropes with the fluid, practiced grace of predatory insects. They wore charcoal gray tactical gear, heavy ballistic plates, and panoramic night vision goggles pushed up on their helmets. They carried short-barreled suppressed carbines. There were no name tapes on their uniforms, no unit patches. 30 operators hit the ground. They moved with a terrifying, silent synchronization. 2 operators sprinted toward the massive steel blast shields that had locked down the main entrance. They didn't bother with breaching charges. They didn't need to blow the doors. One of the operators pulled a ruggedized military tablet from his chest rig, slammed a hardline cable into an external diagnostic port by the doorframe, and typed a 4-digit biometric cipher. Inside the lobby, the golden terminal on the security desk chirped once. The heavy magnetic locks of the front entrance disengaged with a massive echoing crack. The steel blast shields ground upward, retracting into the ceiling. The automatic glass doors blew open, shattered instantly by the sheer force of the rotor wash outside. A hurricane of hot Virginia air, pulverized dust, and blinding sunlight ripped into the red-lit atrium. The Tier 1 operators flooded into the building. They moved like water flowing around rocks, instantly securing the perimeter, fanning out across the lobby. Their suppressed rifles were raised, laser sights cutting sharp green lines through the dust-choked air. They did not shout orders. They did not scream for people to get down. The absolute lethal professionalism in their movement commanded instant compliance. The security guards dropped their tasers. Caldwell and O'Rourke slowly raised their hands in the air, terrified to even blink. Silas Whitmore fell to his knees, throwing his manicured hands over his head, coughing as the rotor dust filled his lungs. He was weeping now, the sudden, overwhelming application of military force completely shattering his reality. Through the dust and the red tactical lighting, the commander of the assault team walked through the shattered entrance. Major Blackwood was a mountain of a man, clad in the same charcoal armor as his operators. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride. He bypassed the cowering security guards. He ignored Caldwell and O'Rourke. He did not even glance at the weeping regional director on the floor. Blackwood walked directly toward the security desk. He stopped exactly 3 feet from Rowena Vance. For a long, agonizing second, the only sound in the atrium was the dying whine of the helicopter rotors outside and the steady beep of the Golden Terminal. Major Blackwood brought his combat boot down hard against the linoleum. He snapped his spine perfectly straight. He brought his right hand up to the brim of his helmet in a razor-sharp, flawless military salute. "Vanguard Actual," Major Blackwood's voice boomed from beneath his tactical mask, deep and resonant. "The perimeter is secure. Command and control is yours." Rowena did not smile. She did not express relief. She slowly returned the salute, a crisp, old-school gesture that carried the weight of 30 years of ghosts. "Stand down your weapons, Major," Rowena instructed quietly. "This is a hospital. These men have seen enough guns." Blackwood dropped his salute. He tapped the communication note on his shoulder. "Weapons safe. Maintain perimeter." Instantly, 30 suppressed rifles lowered toward the floor. The green laser sights vanished. Silas Whitmore lowered his hands, peering through the dust. His eyes darted from the towering, heavily armed major to the gray-haired woman in the faded jacket. His brain finally short-circuited. What are you doing?" Whitmore croaked, his voice cracking violently. He pointed a trembling finger at Rowena. "Arrest her! She's a terrorist! She hacked the federal network! She locked down my building! I am the regional director of this facility, and I demand you take her into custody immediately." Major Blackwood turned his head slowly to look down at the man kneeling on the floor. The operator's eyes, visible behind the ballistic visor, were utterly devoid of sympathy. "Director Silas Whitmore," Blackwood said, his voice dropping into a register that sounded like grinding granite. "You are in violation of Directive Alpha 7. You have attempted to illegally detain and threaten a Tier 1 national security asset." Whitmore blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. "Asset? What asset? She's a crazy old woman with a fake metal card. She hacked the system." "She didn't hack the system, Director," Blackwood replied, stepping toward Whitmore. The massive soldier reached down, grabbed Whitmore by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit, and hauled the director to his feet with terrifying ease. Blackwood leaned in, his voice echoing across the silent atrium. "She wrote the system." Twist 4. Caldwell and O'Rourke stared in absolute shock. The young soldiers looked at the Golden Terminal, then at Rowena, the impenetrable digital fortress of the United States military. The encryption codes that guarded the nuclear silos, the satellite networks, the Pentagon's deepest black ops servers. The system that every modern soldier was taught was infallible, created by anonymous geniuses in deep underground bunkers. It wasn't built by a committee. It was built by the quiet, gray-haired woman standing in front of them. In 1996, Major Blackwood continued, his grip tightening on Whitmore's collar, lifting the director onto his tiptoes. Before the modern internet existed, the Department of Defense realized they needed an unbreakable digital architecture. They tasked a Black Ops cryptography unit to build it, Vanguard 7. They built the foundation that your entire miserable bureaucratic life rests upon. Her clearance doesn't just grant her access to this building, Director. Her clearance owns this building. She is the master key. Whitmore was trembling violently now. His pristine worldview had been violently inverted. He was no longer the king of the castle. He was a tenant who had just insulted the architect. I I didn't know, Whitmore stammered, tears tracking through the dust on his face. The system, the algorithm, it rejected the treatment protocol. General Hawthorne is 82 years old. The algorithm flagged the cellular therapy as a redundant expenditure. I was just following the fiscal guidelines. It cost $4 million to authorize that transfer. You can't blame me for the budget. Rowena Vance moved. She walked around the security desk. She moved with the same slow, measured grace she had entered the building with, but now the air around her felt unbearably heavy. She stopped in front of Whitmore. Major Blackwood held the director in place, but Whitmore flinched away from Rowena as if she were made of radioactive fire. Rowena looked at Whitmore. She looked at his tailored suit, his perfectly polished shoes, the sheer, profound cowardice radiating from his pores. "Director Whitmore," Rowena said softly. The red emergency lights cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the deep lines etched by decades of carrying secrets. "Do you know where that cellular therapy came from? The one sitting in cold storage in Bethesda? The one your algorithm deemed too expensive to waste on an old man?" Whitmore shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Twist 5. 30 years ago, Rowena said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the atrium, General Thaddeus Hawthorne commanded a 6-man team deep into the frozen mountains of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and rogue state actors were attempting to weaponize a highly advanced, experimental, regenerative biological agent. We were sent to secure the data. We were sent to ensure that mankind's worst impulses did not get their hands on a miracle. Rowena paused. She looked past Whitmore, her eyes unfocusing slightly, seeing a snowy ridgeline that existed half a world and a lifetime away. "It was an ambush," she continued, her voice perfectly steady, though the emotional weight of the words hung in the air like a physical pressure. 300 mercenaries against 6 Americans. General Hawthorne took a bullet to the chest. He took shrapnel to his legs, but he did not let us fall back. He ordered us to hold the line while I extracted the biological data from the mainframe. Rowena looked down at her hands, the hands that had typed the codes while her brothers bled out in the snow. 4 members of Vanguard 7 died on that mountain, Rowena whispered. The silence in the VA atrium was absolute. The elderly veterans in the waiting area were standing now, some with tears in their eyes, recognizing the sacred cadence of a combat eulogy. They bled to death in the freezing mud to protect a hard drive. We brought that data home. We handed it to the Department of Defense. And for 30 years, civilian scientists have used the blood of my team to develop the exact regenerative cellular therapy that you just denied General Hawthorne. She stepped closer to Whitmore. Her eyes were no longer cold. They were burning with a terrifying, righteous fury. "That therapy does not belong to your budget, Director," Rowena stated, her voice vibrating with absolute authority. "It does not belong to your algorithm. It was paid for in advance. It was paid for by the lives of the men who died, so you could sit in an air-conditioned office and wear a silk tie. The United States government owes Thaddeus Hawthorne a blood debt, and I am here to collect it." Whitmore let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. His legs gave out entirely. Major Blackwood released his grip, and the regional director collapsed into a heap on the dusty linoleum floor. A broken, terrified bureaucrat confronted by the crushing weight of actual history. Rowena turned her back on Whitmore. She did not need to see him crawl. He was entirely irrelevant now. She walked back to the security desk. Caldwell and O'Rourke pressed themselves against the back wall, staring at her with a mixture of absolute awe and profound shame. They had mocked this woman. They had laughed at the metal card that held the weight of the free world. Rowena picked up her heavy titanium plate from the scanner pad. The moment the metal broke contact with the induction reader, the golden triangle on the monitor vanished. The deafening klaxons cut off instantly. The red emergency lights powered down, and the bright, sterile fluorescent bulbs flickered back to life, illuminating the dust swirling in the atrium. The system had returned to normal. But the balance of power in the room had shifted permanently. Rowena turned to Major Blackwood. "Major," Rowena said, slipping the titanium card back into the deep pocket of her faded olive jacket. "Have your medics prep a transport unit. We are going to the hospice wing. We are picking up General Hawthorne, and we are flying him to Bethesda." Blackwood nodded sharply. "Yes, ma'am. And the civilian administrators?" Rowena looked over her shoulder at the weeping Silas Whitmore and the terrified administrative staff peeking out from behind the heavy doors. "Leave them," Rowena said softly, picking up her thin manila folder. "Let them clean up the lobby. It's time they learned how to work for a living." She walked past the shattered glass doors, out into the blinding Virginia sunlight, the heavy thrum of the Black Hawk rotors waiting to carry her back into the fight. "Leave them," Rowena said softly, picking up her thin manila folder. "Let them clean up the lobby. It's time they learned how to work for a living." Before Rowena could take another step toward the shattered glass doors, the second wave of reality crashed into the Alexandria Veterans Affairs Medical Center. The heavy thrum of the Black Hawk helicopters idling on the ruined front lawn was a constant, vibrating pressure in the chest. But piercing through that mechanical roar came the screeching of high-performance tires. Rowena Vance stopped in the center of the atrium. She was no longer looking at Silas Whitmore, who remained crumpled on the floor, weeping into his tailored sleeves. She was looking past the broken entrance, out toward the access road where a convoy of pitch-black armored SUVs was currently tearing through the manicured hedges, ignoring the paved driveways to reach the building as fast as physics allowed. The vehicles slammed to a halt behind the military perimeter. The doors flew open. Men in dark, immaculate suits stepped out into the oppressive Virginia heat. They did not move like politicians. They moved with the frantic, tightly coiled energy of men who had just watched their entire digital empire flash before their eyes. These were the crisis managers from the Pentagon, the ghost walkers from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the men who lived their lives in windowless rooms beneath the earth, monitoring the invisible walls that kept the nation safe. Leading them was Undersecretary Marcus Thorne. He was a man of 65 with silver hair swept back from a sharp, aristocratic face. He possessed an aura of absolute, terrifying bureaucratic power. He was the man who whispered in the ear of the Secretary of Defense. He was the man who authorized drone strikes and black budgets. But as Thorne walked through the shattered glass of the VA lobby, flanked by Secret Service agents and four-star aides, he did not look powerful. He looked breathless. He looked deeply, profoundly unsettled. Thorne's eyes swept over the chaotic scene. He saw the Tier 1 operators holding the perimeter. He saw the terrified civilian staff. He saw the weeping regional director on the floor. And then, standing perfectly still amidst the wreckage, he saw the gray-haired woman in the faded olive jacket. Thorne stopped. The entourage behind him stopped. The Undersecretary of Defense took a slow, deep breath, adjusting his silk tie with a hand that trembled just a fraction of an inch. He stepped forward alone, leaving his security detail behind. He walked until he was 5 feet away from Rowena. He did not demand answers. He did not threaten her with federal prison. Undersecretary Thorne stood at attention and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound, uncharacteristic deference from a man who answered to almost no one. "Architect Vance," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the sudden, heavy silence of the atrium. It was not a question, it was a recognition. Rowena looked at him. Her eyes were empty of anger, empty of triumph. They were the eyes of a woman who had simply come to collect a debt. "Undersecretary," Rowena replied softly. Thorne swallowed hard. He looked at the golden glow still emitting from the digital terminal behind the security desk. "Ma'am, 45 minutes ago, the National Military Command Center lost its primary logistical routing capabilities. The Eastern Seaboard's defense grid automatically shifted into a defensive quarantine posture. Nuclear silos in the Midwest reported a phantom hand on their locking mechanisms. The Pentagon thought we were under a coordinated cyber attack by a hostile nation-state. Thorne paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. It took our highest-level cryptographers 20 minutes to realize we were not being attacked. We were being locked out of our own house by the Foundation itself, the Vanguard Protocol. Rowena did not offer an apology. She stood with her hands resting easily at her sides. The Foundation is functioning exactly as I designed it to, Undersecretary. It recognized an inferior security matrix attempting to deny a Tier 1 asset. It responded by assuming direct control. Thorne nodded quickly, desperately. Yes, we understand that now. But Architect Vance, you have the entire Department of Defense by the throat. Supply chains are frozen. Troop movements are grounded. The system is waiting for your all clear. I need you to put that titanium card back onto the induction reader and disengage the Omega Absolute lock. I am begging you. The country cannot function while you hold the keys. Rowena turned her head slowly, looking back at the weeping form of Silas Whitmore. The regional director was looking up at the undersecretary, his tear-streaked face twisted in pathetic hope, believing that the arrival of the Pentagon meant his salvation. Undersecretary Thorne, Rowena said, her voice carrying the cold, hard weight of an anvil. Do you know who that man is? Thorne glanced down at Whitmore with an expression of sheer disgust. I am aware of his identity. He is the regional director of this facility. He was the regional director, Rowena corrected, her tone leaving no room for debate. He is a man who designed an algorithm to deny life-saving cellular therapy to combat veterans over the age of 80. He decided that General Thaddeus Hawthorne, the man whose blood bought the data that built your modern military, was not worth the cost of a helicopter flight to Bethesda. Thorne's eyes widened. He looked at Whitmore, and the disgust on the undersecretary's face hardened into absolute, lethal rage. Director Whitmore, Thorne said, his voice dripping with venom. Is this true? Did you deny medical extraction to Vanguard Actual? It was the algorithm, Whitmore shrieked, scrambling backward on the linoleum. It was the budget constraints. I was following the fiscal guidelines handed down by the Congressional Oversight Committee. You cannot hold me responsible for the budget. Thorne looked back at Rowena. The unspoken understanding between them was instantaneous. The system had become a monster, feeding on the very people it was built to protect. Architect Vance, Thorne said quietly, his posture straightening. What are your terms? My terms are simple, Rowena stated. General Hawthorne is currently suffocating in a hospice bed 3 miles from here. Major Blackwood and his operators are going to fly to that facility. They are going to load General Hawthorne onto that Black Hawk. They are going to fly him to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda. He will receive the experimental cellular therapy. He will be placed in the highest tier VIP recovery suite, and his medical bills for the remainder of his natural life will be classified as a black budget defense expenditure, entirely immune from civilian oversight. Thorne didn't even blink. He didn't consult an aide. He didn't ask for time to review the budget. Done, Thorne said instantly. He turned to his trailing entourage and pointed at a 4-star general standing near the shattered doors. General, get on the satellite uplink. Call Walter Reed. Tell the director of medicine to clear the VIP wing. If anyone argues, tell them they are arguing with the Secretary of Defense. Move! The general spun on his heel and sprinted back to the SUVs. Thorne turned his attention back to the pathetic figure on the floor. He signaled to 2 massive, broad-shouldered agents standing near the entrance. Agents, pick this piece of garbage off the floor, strip him of his facility credentials, escort him to a federal holding vehicle. I want a full forensic audit of his personal and professional finances going back 10 years. If he stole a single paperclip from the VA budget, I want him prosecuted under the Espionage Act for sabotaging military readiness. Whitmore screamed. It was a high-pitched, terrifying sound of a man watching his entire universe collapse. The two agents hauled him to his feet by his armpits, dragging him effortlessly across the lobby. His polished Italian shoes dragged uselessly against the floor. He kicked, he sobbed, he begged, but the elderly veterans sitting in the waiting area merely watched him go, their faces carved from stone, their eyes reflecting the quiet, long-awaited arrival of justice. As Whitmore was dragged out into the blinding sunlight, the heavy silence returned to the atrium. Undersecretary Thorne looked at Rowena. "The transport is secured. The director has been removed. Architect Vance, I implore you, please, release the network." Rowena did not move toward the terminal, not yet. She turned her back to the undersecretary. She walked slowly toward the reinforced security desk. Behind the laminate counter, Private Caldwell and Specialist O'Rourke were standing at rigid attention. Their faces were the color of wet ash. They were shaking. They were two young men who had spent their morning mocking an old woman, only to discover they had spit in the face of a living God. They were waiting for the axe to fall. They were waiting for the court-martial, the dishonorable discharge, the federal prison sentence. Rowena stopped in front of the desk. She looked at Caldwell. She looked at O'Rourke. She saw the terror in their eyes. She saw the youth they had not yet lost, the innocence they tried to hide behind a mask of cynical boredom. She did not yell. She did not raise her voice. "Stand at ease, soldiers," Rowena commanded softly. Caldwell and O'Rourke blinked, their rigid postures relaxing just a fraction, though the terror in their eyes remained. Rowena leaned her hands on the edge of the security desk. She looked at the crisp, clean fabric of Caldwell's uniform. She looked at the polished brass of his name tag. "You look at this building," Rowena said, her voice a low, rhythmic cadence that carried the hypnotic weight of a campfire storyteller. "You look at the digital screens, the biometric scanners, the clean uniforms you wear. You think this is the military. You think the military is a corporation, a set of rules, a paycheck." She reached out, her calloused, scarred fingers lightly touching the fabric of Caldwell's sleeve. The young private held his breath. "Do you know what this uniform is made of, Private Caldwell?" she asked softly. Caldwell swallowed, his vocal cords paralyzed. He shook his head minutely. "It is not made of cotton," Rowena whispered, her eyes burning with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. "It is woven from the blood of the men and women who died in the mud so that you could stand in the air conditioning. It is dyed in the grief of the mothers who received folded flags. It is stitched together by the shattered minds of the old men sitting in those plastic chairs behind you." Rowena stepped back, her gaze sweeping over both of them. "You laughed at my card because it was old. You laughed because it did not fit into your modern, sleek, comfortable world. But your world only exists because my generation and the generations before us stood in the dark and held the line." O'Rourke closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean line through the dust on his cheek. The profound, crushing weight of his own arrogance was entirely unbearable. "I am not going to ruin your careers," Rowena said quietly. Both soldiers snapped their eyes open in disbelief. "I am not going to ask for your discharge," she continued, "because if I break you, you learn nothing. But you will remember this day. For the rest of your lives, every time you put on that uniform, every time you look at a veteran who moves a little too slow, or speaks a little too softly, or hands you a piece of identification you do not understand, you will remember the vanguard." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "You will treat them with the absolute, uncompromising reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, because they are the reason you breathe free air. Do you understand me, Private? Do you understand me, Specialist?" "Yes, ma'am," Caldwell choked out, his voice breaking entirely, tears streaming freely down his face. "Yes, ma'am, I swear to God, I understand." "Yes, Architect," O'Rourke whispered, his chin trembling. Rowena held their gaze for a long moment, ensuring the lesson was carved deep into the marrow of their bones. Then she gave a single firm nod. She stepped away from the desk. She turned back to Undersecretary Thorne, who had watched the exchange with a look of profound, silent respect. Thorne took a step forward. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound folio bearing the presidential seal. "Architect Vance," Thorne said, his tone shifting from desperation to a deeply calculated diplomacy. "Before you release the network, I have been authorized by the Oval Office to make you a formal proposition." Rowena stopped. She looked at the leather folio. The Vanguard Protocol was designed for a world on the brink of nuclear annihilation, Thorne explained, opening the folio to reveal a single sheet of heavy parchment signed by the Commander-in-Chief. But the world has changed. The threats are different. The bureaucracy, as you have so violently demonstrated today, is broken. It is a machine that has forgotten its purpose. Thorne held out a silver pen. "The President is offering to formally reinstate your rank, a seat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a special advisor for asymmetric digital warfare and veteran affairs, unprecedented security clearance, a black budget of your own. You have the power to tear down the algorithms. You have the power to fix the system from the inside. We need the Vanguard, Rowena. The country needs you to come back out of the shadows." Silence descended on the atrium. The Tier 1 operators watched. The elderly veterans watched. Private Caldwell and Specialist O'Rourke held their breath. It was the ultimate vindication. The architect thrown out into the cold, being begged to return to the throne she had built. Absolute power. Absolute authority to right the wrongs she had suffered. Rowena looked at the silver pen. She looked at the presidential signature. She thought of the halls of the Pentagon, the endless meetings, the political maneuvering, the compromises made in air-conditioned rooms. She thought of the men in suits who smiled to your face and calculated your expendability the moment you turned your back. Slowly, Rowena raised her eyes to meet Thorne's. Her face was a mask of perfect, impenetrable tranquility. "No." Thorne blinked, his hand holding the pen, freezing in midair. "Architect, you would have the power to change everything. You could fire every man like Silas Whitmore in the country." "Power is a poison, Undersecretary," Rowena replied softly. "You asked me to sit at a desk in Washington. You asked me to become the very thing I despise. A person who calculates the value of a soldier's life from behind a screen." She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "I am a ghost, Mr. Thorne. I belong to a world that no longer exists. My war is over. I only came back today to save my commander. I have no interest in ruling your empire." Thorne lowered the pen. He looked at the gray-haired woman, realizing with a terrifying clarity that she was completely incorruptible. There was nothing he could offer her. There was nothing she wanted. "I understand," Thorne said, his voice thick with genuine regret. He closed the leather folio. "Then, will you release the network? Please." Rowena turned away from the Undersecretary. She walked back toward the security desk. Caldwell and O'Rourke immediately stepped back, giving her a wide berth, their eyes wide with reverence. Rowena reached into the pocket of her olive jacket. She pulled out the heavy, oxidized titanium card, the artifact, the piece of history that had brought the most powerful military apparatus on Earth to its knees. She looked at the golden, pulsing screen of the biometric terminal. She did not simply tap the card against the reader. She reached out and placed her fingers on the modern, sleek black keyboard. Her fingers moved. They did not move like a woman in her 50s navigating a computer. They moved with a blinding, terrifying speed, a kinetic blur of muscle memory that had been forged in the high-stakes cryptography labs of the Cold War. The keystroke sounded like a burst of machine gun fire, echoing in the quiet lobby. Undersecretary Thorne frowned, stepping forward. "Architect? What are you doing? You just need to scan the induction plate." Rowena did not stop typing. Code began to cascade down the golden monitor. Not standard system code, but deep, root-level machine language. The foundational architecture of the United States military network was being rewritten in real time. "I am releasing your network, Undersecretary," Rowena said, her eyes locked on the scrolling lines of light. "But before I hand the keys back, I am leaving a structural reinforcement in the foundation, a pillar that your accountants will never be able to tear down." Thorne's face went pale. "What kind of pillar?" Rowena hit the enter key with a resounding crack. The screen flashed from gold to brilliant, blinding white. "Directive 82, Rowena stated, stepping back from the keyboard. "I have just hard-coded a permanent, unalterable execution command into the root directory of the Department of Veterans Affairs neural network. It is replicated across every secure server in the hemisphere. It cannot be deleted. It cannot be patched. If you try to remove it, the system will instantly self-destruct." Thorne stared at the white screen, his heart pounding in his chest. "What does it do?" Rowena turned to look at the elderly veterans sitting in the plastic chairs across the atrium. The men with the canes, the men with the oxygen tanks, the men who had been told to wait. "Directive 82 is an automated override," Rowena explained, her voice carrying a profound, beautiful finality. "From this exact moment forward, any veteran entered into the VA system who is over the age of 75 is automatically upgraded to Tier 1 VIP status." Thorne gasped, his geopolitical mind instantly calculating the ramifications. "No wait times," Rowena continued, her voice rising, filling the room with the promise of salvation. "No board approvals, no budget rejections. The moment a doctor prescribes a treatment for an elderly veteran, the system will instantly authorize the expenditure, regardless of cost. It will bypass the regional directors. It will bypass the congressional oversight algorithms. It is a permanent digital fast track. You will care for your oldest warriors, Undersecretary, not because it is profitable, but because the system now gives you no other choice." In the waiting area, an old man in a faded navy ball cap slowly covered his face with his hands and began to weep. Thorne stood paralyzed. He knew the financial cost of what she had just done would be astronomical. He knew the politicians in Washington would scream, but he also knew, deep in his soul, that it was the most profoundly righteous act he had ever witnessed. Rowena Vance picked up the heavy titanium card. She looked at the faded photograph of her younger self. She looked at the etched alphanumeric codes. She felt the weight of the metal in her palm. It had been her shield, her weapon, her identity. But her war was truly over now. The Vanguard had fired its last shot. Rowena closed her fist around the card. She placed her hands on either side of the heavy titanium plate. With a sudden, violent flex of her arms, a display of physical strength that betrayed decades of brutal combat conditioning, Rowena twisted the metal. The titanium shrieked, a high-pitched metallic scream. The induction micro-lattice embedded inside the alloy snapped. The card warped, bent in half, and died. The digital terminal on the desk instantly reverted from blinding white to the standard, boring, blue and white interface of the VA login screen. The building's air conditioning hummed back to full power. The deep, subsonic vibration in the floor vanished. The network was free. The Empire had its toys back, but the Empire would never be the same. Rowena dropped the bent, broken piece of scrap metal onto the security desk. It clattered against the laminate, completely devoid of power, just a broken piece of the past. She picked up her thin manila folder. Rowena did not salute Undersecretary Thorne. She did not look back at the young guards. She turned and walked toward the shattered front entrance. Major Blackwood stepped out of her way, raising his hand to his helmet in a silent, deeply respectful salute. The 30 Tier 1 operators lining the perimeter followed suit, a corridor of elite warriors paying tribute to the ghost who had walked among them. Rowena stepped out into the blinding Virginia sunlight. The heat washed over her, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt like the warmth of a hard-earned morning. On the lawn, the Black Hawk helicopter was already spinning up its rotors to maximum RPM, preparing to lift off to the hospice wing to save a dying general. Rowena bypassed the helicopters. She bypassed the fleet of armored SUVs. She walked across the parking lot, the dust swirling around her scuffed leather boots. She reached a faded, 10-year-old pickup truck, parked perfectly between the painted yellow lines. She opened the heavy door, climbed into the cab, and tossed the manila folder onto the passenger seat. She turned the key. The engine roared to life with a comforting, mechanical rumble. Rowena Vance shifted the truck into gear. She drove out of the parking lot, merging onto the highway. Her window rolled down, the wind catching the silver streaks in her hair. She drove toward the quiet expanse of the country she had bled for, a country she had just forced to remember its soul. Back in the atrium, Undersecretary Thorne stood over the broken piece of titanium, the silence in the room heavier than it had ever been. He looked at the old men in the waiting area, who were standing taller now, their dignity restored by a few lines of unbreakable code. Thorne reached out and picked up the broken metal card. He held it carefully, like a fragile piece of glass. "Undersecretary," one of his aides asked nervously, stepping up behind him. "Sir, what do we do now? The budget office is going to lose their minds when they see this new directive." Thorne stared at the bent metal. A slow, deeply reverent smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Let them lose their minds," Thorne whispered. He slipped the broken Vanguard card into his breast pocket, placing it directly over his heart. "The rest of us are going to get back to work. We have a lot of debts to pay."